Street a year ago, after the sting of the 2012 defeats, and with Republicans wringing their hands about tanking approval ratings, party leaders launched an internal audit, hoping to find a prescription for rebranding. A year later, how have they done? The RNC argues that they've made progress on what was in their control: mechanics, building a permanent ground game by putting most of the RNC political staff in the field instead of in Washington, hiring new field staff to reach out to Africans, Hispanics, and Asian Americans, and launching Parabellum Labs, a self-described tech startup inside the RNC, as a sign of the party's push to be better on the data. The RNC points to David Jolly's victory, in fact, in the competitive Florida special election last week, as a sign that their investments on the ground are beginning to pay some dividends. And after a painfully long 2012 primary season for the presidential race, the RNC has also voted to move back the Republican convention to June or July, shortening the primary process and allowing them to tap into general election money before late August or early September. So that's the mechanical fixes. But here's the question: will improvements in mechanics make the difference if the Republican Party doesn't fix its messaging problems? Joining me now is RNC Chairman Reince Priebus. Mr. Chairman, good morning to you, sir.
Good morning, Chuck.
And I do think, and I know we've had this discussion before when we've talked about this, on what you set out to do with this report, this internal audit. And on the messaging front, you would argue you don't have as big of a role as you do on mechanics. Do you still believe that to be the case?
Well, here's what I recognize, Chuck, and I think people have to understand the differences in two different types of elections. We've got a party nationally that has a hard time losing midterms and a hard time winning presidentials. And so why is that? I mean, you look at where I'm from in Wisconsin. If you're a Republican running for town board or governor, you've got a pretty good chance of winning. But it's also a state that hasn't gone for a president, Republican president, since 1988. And so what I'm suggesting is that our long-term investments on the ground are more in line with what we need to be doing to win a presidential election, because I think presidential elections come down to how you feel about a candidate, who you like, who you relate to, and that kind of feeling is not something that can just be bought 30-second ads on TV. And that's why I think having a huge investment on the ground in these battleground states for 4 straight years will pay off dividends in 2016. That's why I think it's related.
Well, let's talk about, I mean, obviously there have been some messaging gains, and in the messaging issues, and when you look at your report, you talked about figuring out better ways to talk to women, better ways to talk to African Americans, Asians, Hispanics. But here's the executive director of the Texas Republican Party. Let me play a soundbite of what she said on the issue of equal pay.
Men are better negotiators, and I would encourage women, instead of pursuing the courts for action, to become better negotiators.
And I know now, Chairman Priebus, I know you're going to say you can't speak and defend everybody's comments from everybody, but this is somebody representing the Republican Party in the state of Texas. These things accumulate.
Well, I mean, but both sides, you know, one side doesn't have a monopoly on these kinds of comments. I mean, you know, when Joe Biden said, you know, we want to, whatever he said, break you from these chains or whatever he said, listen, he's the vice president of the United States of America. I mean, you're pointing out some staffer at a state GOP office. You know, I mean, the fact is, what I'm trying to suggest,
executive director, it's the person running, the state party of Texas.
Well, and I brought up the vice president of the United States, Chuck. Okay, I mean, we want to start cherry.
Okay.
The fact is, here's my point. 37% of Hispanics have self-identified as conservatives. My point to you is that that's great, but if you're not in the Hispanic communities across the country with people that are communicating with the folks that are self-identifying as conservatives, it's not going to make a difference when it comes to election day. And so what I'm suggesting is that our issues that I'm trying to fix are more fundamental than just top-line messaging. It's a matter of having a conduit in the community that's actually speaking on a long-term basis to help move the dial a couple notches each and every year.
I'm going to read you a quote. Doug Sosnick, who was Bill Clinton's political director, wrote this big memo in Politico magazine this week, basically making this, it was sort of, I guess, in some ways agreeing with what you said about how Republicans seem to be able to do no wrong in midterms and do no right in presidentials. Here was his big conclusion. Ironically, Republicans' short-term tactics to pick up additional seats in the 2014 midterms, as well as the rightward pressures of the presidential primary process, will only reinforce the public's perception of the Republican Party as unwelcoming and out of step with the majority of Americans. How do you fix that perception? Because that feels as if that's where we're headed again.
Well, I don't think so, Chuck. I mean, the fact of the matter is Mitt Romney won on the question of on the message. He won on jobs. He won on the economy. He won on the question of who do you actually think would make a better president. But where he lost was on the question of who cares about you. And that's a matter of familiarity. It's a matter of communication on the ground. That's how we're going to fix it, Chuck. And the fact is, I think if we fix these problems, you put a candidate on the ballot that people want to sit down and have a beer with, I think that we can win. And we're not talking about carpeting the world here in 2 years. But what we're talking about is instead of getting 27% of the Hispanic vote, if we work like dogs, can we get 35? You know, instead of 5% in the African-American community, can we get to 9%? And I think if we do that and then slowly improve over time in these national elections, I think we can win. I mean, in spite of having... Go ahead, sorry.
No, finish it. Finish your thought.
I was just going to say, you know, look, Mitt Romney, in spite of really not having a big national party presence, no technology, no data, no built-in Hispanic, African-American, Asian engagement effort, he's still, to an incumbent president that spent $1 billion that half the country liked, he still came within 240,000 votes in 4 states away from winning.
Do you think, though, that you can fix...
These are margins.
I understand that, but do you really think you can fix immigration? You know, in the report a year ago, it called for comprehensive immigration reform. And I know yesterday you said, well, there's different definitions of what that looks like. There's a disagreement with what that looks like. But if the Republican Party is seen as being the ones holding up immigration going into 2016, how does that fix your Hispanic problem?
Well, I mean, for one thing, if you're not in the community on a long-term basis, it's not going to fix any problem at all, because if you've got no conduit to deliver a message, it doesn't matter what the message is. And so that's what the first thing that we need to fix. But secondly, I think you are seeing, though, Chuck, a consensus within the party that very serious immigration reform has to take place. I mean, Rand Paul, I think it was a year ago today, I might be off by a day, went to the National Hispanic Chamber, and Rand Paul is the one that called for comprehensive immigration reform. So you have people at all spectrums in our party saying we need to do this. But you know what? It takes 2 to tango, and you need partners in the White House, you need partners in the Senate, and you need to find a way to get to some reasonable consensus. And unfortunately, it's not possible with having a leaderless White House and, you know, and Harry Reid that doesn't want to act.
Well, Reince Priebus, I will leave it there. The Senate did produce a bill. Right now, it's the House that hasn't produced a bill, which is led by the Republicans. But I will leave it there. Chairman Reince Priebus, thanks for coming on this 1-year anniversary of your big report.